So, in issue number 4, we went through the steps of writing a description of a panel in a comic. For our next essay, however, you'll need to first describe and then analyze not only a couple panels, but also a sequence of at least a couple pages. And this time, we'll also switch our framework of analysis. For this essay, we'll instead apply the framework that Scott McCloud introduces in the sections called the 5 Choices and 5 Choices Checklist in his book, Making Comics, and/or the framework that Johannes Schmidt introduces in his article, Graphic Nonviolence, Framing Good Trouble in John Lewis's March. In this video, I'll work with McCloud's 5 choices as my example framework of analysis. So I won't talk about Schmidt's framing here, except to point out that when Schmidt uses the word frame, it has more meanings than the same word does in McCloud. So in Making Comics, McCloud lists 5 choices that comics creators make: choice of moment, choice of frame, choice of image, choice of word, and choice of flow. He provides a really readable chart of these on page 37, which we will consult when we analyze the sequence in John Lewis, Andrew Aydin, and Nate Powell's March, Book 1. First, let's talk about choice of moment. One crucial difference between the Black Panther comics we've already read and March is our protagonist in Black Panther, T'Challa, is fictional, but our protagonist in March, John Lewis, is non-fictional. That is, the sequences in March are based on events in Lewis's real life. And when March, Book 1, was published in 2013, Lewis had lived 73 very eventful years. So when we talk about the choice of moment in relation to the opening pages of March, we can think first about Lewis's choice to start his story not with, say, the event of his birth in 1940, but with an event that occurred in 1965 when he was 25 years old. This choice of starting in media res, which is Latin for in the middle of things, allows Lewis and his collaborators Aydin and Powell to create an anecdote that arouses curiosity and builds suspense. Why are Lewis and his close collaborators in the civil rights movement standing unarmed on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, about to come into conflict with armed Alabama state troopers? That's arousing my curiosity as a reader. What is going to happen to Lewis after a baton-wielding state trooper beats him into unconsciousness, communicated by this fade to black on page 9. That's leaving me in suspense as a reader. But when McCloud talks about choice of moment in Making Comics, he's even more so talking about the selection of the specific moments that are depicted in the panels. By my count, in these first 5 pages of March, there are 27 panels. So these are the 27 moments that Lewis, Aydin, and Powell chose to communicate Lewis's experience as a participant in the event that later came to be called Bloody Sunday. And without straying too far into the content I would cover in a more specialized class, such as writing creative nonfiction, I would point out that part of the power in these pages is the choice to present them not objectively, but subjectively. That is, we see these moments, this event, through the perspective of a participant, John Lewis. March is his subjective perspective on the events in his life. So, second, let's talk about choice of frame. With this term, McCloud means to communicate the choice of what is included in the panel, as well as how close to or far away from the reader it is drawn to appear. On page 5 of March, for example, you'll notice the choice to frame what we see in the first panel at a distance that allows us to see the name Edmund Pettus Bridge, which helps to establish the setting of this scene, as well as the fact that there is a long line of protesters trying to cross it on foot. In the first panel on page 6, we see a choice of frame in which the bridge appears to be even farther from us as readers, which allows us to see not only the unarmed protesters crossing the bridge, but also the armed state troopers waiting to confront them at the end of it. Panels framed like this tend to be called establishing shots because they help to establish essential elements of a scene, such as setting, character, and/or conflict. But among these 27 panels in this sequence on the opening pages of March, there are also a lot of close-ups, panels that are framed in such a way that things such as characters' faces appear to be much closer to us as readers. That enables us to read their facial expressions in a way that could help us to understand the emotions that they are feeling. For example, we could look at these close-ups in the third and fourth panels on page 8 to get a sense of the emotions that the protesters felt as the troopers attacked them. Also on page 8 and 9, we can talk about how the shape of the frame can also be significant. Notice how on pages 5, 6, and 7, before the order of the peaceful protest falls into the chaos of the attack, the panels are framed as mostly straight rectangles, very regular. However, the shape of the panels becomes very irregular on pages 8 and 9 when the state troopers attack. The lines are more jagged, the corners of the panels are sharper, and we also notice how the panels overlap one another in a way they did not on the preceding 3 pages. These moments are becoming more violent, more chaotic. So, third, let's talk about choice of flow. This is mostly about how comics creators choose to guide their readers' eyes from panel to panel, as well as within the panels. In the first 3 pages of March, Lewis, Aiden, and Powell created a relatively smooth and easy flow for us, partly through the choice of frame. For example, here on page 5, our eyes flow smoothly from the top panel to the panel on the left of the second tier, to the panel on the right of the second tier, to the panel on the third tier, to the panel on the fourth tier. However, on the 4th and 5th pages, they create a relatively rough and difficult flow for us to follow, again, partly through the choice of frame. For example, here on page 8, my eyes would normally move from the panel on the left of the first tier to the panel on the right of the first tier. However, the overlapping of this panel on the left of the second tier with both those panels on the first tier leaves me unsure of the flow. Am I supposed to go from the left panel on the first tier to the left panel on the second tier, to the right panel on the first tier, to the right panel on the second tier? I would argue that the choice of flow here, making it difficult to determine, helps to capture the chaotic nature of the events, the moments shown in these panels. So, fourth, let's talk about choice of image. On page 9, which is the last in the sequence, we see some really striking, no disrespectful pun intended, choices of images. Think about how Lewis, Aiden, and Powell choose not to show the impact of the state trooper's baton on Lewis's head here. Instead, in the first panel, we see the trooper with his outstretched baton standing threateningly over Lewis, who is lying defenseless on his stomach. Then, in the second panel, we see the shadow of the state trooper with his baton raised and Lewis's hands gripping the pavement. And as much as characters' faces can express emotions, so can their hands. And bear in mind that the image in the second panel is drawn in such a way that we are essentially seeing what Lewis saw in that moment. We are seeing this moment from his subjective perspective as a participant in the event. Then, in the third, we see a black panel that communicates that Lewis has blacked out, has been knocked unconscious by the impact of the baton on his head. And we get a sense of the violence of the impact from these jagged lines that make the upper edge of the frame of the fourth panel. Finally, fifth, let's talk about choice of word. Now, in our earlier issues, we've talked about 4 categories of words in comics: dialogue, thought, narration, and sound effects. We haven't spent as much time thinking about sound effects as we have the other 3 categories of words, but they play an important role on pages 8 and 9 of March. On both these pages, we see words, sound effects, that help to communicate to us as readers the experiences of these unarmed protesters being beaten by these armed troopers. For example, in the second panel on page 8, we can think not only about words such as whap, crack, and thump, but also the expressive way in which they are rendered. Or, as another example, we can look at the use of the sound effect clink between the 2 panels in the second tier, and then the subsequent sound effects of tink, tink, clink in the smaller panel on the left in the 3rd tier, and in the larger panel on the right in the 3rd tier, as capturing the sound of a metal canister of tear gas first bouncing across the pavement of the bridge, then spreading its gas among the protesters. And in that larger panel on the right of the 3rd tier, we also see sound effects that communicate the involuntary responses of their lungs to the tear gas: hack, hack here, and cough, cough there. All 5 of these choices by the creators of this comic help to communicate with clarity to me as a reader the struggles that the protagonists go through in their attempt to create a better society. And this is how we can use this framework of analysis from McCloud, his 5 choices, to analyze a sequence in March, Book 1. Let me make one last pitch, though, for you to also take a look at Schmid's article. One of the reasons I've included Schmid's graphic violence in the readings for this module of our class is that 2 of the paragraphs in his essay provide an excellent example of a description and an analysis of how Lewis, Aidan, and Powell's choices on a couple pages in March help to show our protagonist's struggles to create a better society. Specifically, the pages in March that Schmid concentrates on are 8 and 9, and the paragraphs in his article in which he describes and analyzes them are 22 and 23. So even if you decide you would prefer to only use McCloud's 5 choices framework of analysis in your essay, I would definitely recommend that you take the time to look at that excellent example of a description and an analysis of 2 pages of a comic in Schmid's article.